Morning, everybody. This is Josh Valentine, the Communications Manager for the Clean Coalition. And thanks very much for attending another one of our webinars. We're going to be talking today about the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid in the Santa Barbara region of California. And presenting today is our Executive Director and Founder, Craig Lewis. Before we get started, notice on your screen that there is a screenshot of the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you'd like to ask a question at the end of the webinar, enter in your question into the questions field. And we'll try to answer those questions during the Q&A session. A webinar recording and the slides in PowerPoint and PDF formats will be sent to all registered attendees within the next 2 days. All of our webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, and on our YouTube channel. And if you have any other questions, direct them to me. My email at the bottom there is josh@clean-coalition.org. So let's get right to it. I'm going to pass it off to Craig Lewis.
Great, thank you, Josh. And you know, as a starting point, let me just say that the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid is an absolutely massive, multi-dimensional initiative, and it will fulfill just a huge vision. So I think that everybody by the end of this presentation will have an appreciation for those facts. And before I really dig into it, I do want to make a shout out to some of the partners that the Clean Coalition works with on the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid. And I want to start with the World Business Academy, which we stand on the shoulders of, because the World Business Academy has been essentially setting the stage for the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid for about a decade. I also want to shout out to the Community Environmental Council, which is probably the most comprehensive environmental organization that is really focused on the Santa Barbara region. Does work in neighboring counties as well, but I think is primarily focused in Santa Barbara and has been helpful, especially at the starting stages of the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid initiative. And then thirdly, I want to shout out to the Sierra Club for being the Sierra Club, and also for having Katie Davis, who is an absolutely relentless supporter of everything that the Sierra Club pushes, and has been a great ally for the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid. And she is a force to reckon with, and we're so happy that she lives right in the middle of the Goleta Load Pocket. She definitely has her heart and her head in the right place. Okay, so let me just make sure everybody has a basic understanding of the Clean Coalition. Our mission in life is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And our renewable energy end game, where we see the renewable energy, we see it being 100% of the entire energy mix. Once it really has transformed, to a renewable energy future, and we see that out of that 100%, a quarter of it, 25%, will be local, which means interconnected within the distribution grid, and that means it will be able to provide resilience without any dependence on the transmission grid, which is highly vulnerable. And if we're getting 25% from local, that of course means that we're going to be getting the other 75% remote, which is going to be dependent on the transmission grid. But this 25% local, 75% remote, the Clean Coalition believes is about the right balance between local and remote in terms of what is possible. The good news is that when you get 25% of your renewables locally, you have plenty to provide indefinite renewables-driven backup power to your critical community facilities, and a whole lot more of your facilities, on a normal basis. But even on the absolutely worst weather day, kind of situational scenario, you will be able to provide indefinite renewables driven backup power to your critical community facilities. All right, so before I dig into the Goleta Load Pocket specifics, I'm going to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what a community microgrid is. And that is, a community microgrid is a new approach for designing and operating the electric grid, stacked with local renewables and staged for resilience. So it basically, a community microgrid takes a target grid area, which ultimately would include at least one substation, and ultimately would include an entire grid area served by a transmission to distribution substation, and that would set the stage for a distribution system operator. As I mentioned multiple times, a community microgrid has high penetrations of local renewables and is staged for resilience and renewables driven resilience for at least the critical community facilities in that grid area. And that can be achieved, as I said, with the 25% of the total energy mix coming from local renewables. Community microgrids, given that they are a modular design, they are designed for a gridded area, ideally up to a substation, and that means that they can be replicated and extended very easily throughout a single utility service territory, but also just stamped out into additional utility service territories around the state, country, and around the globe. All right, so the Goleta Load Pocket, what is that? The Goleta Load Pocket is the perfect opportunity for a comprehensive community microgrid. It spans 70 miles of California coastline from Point Conception to Lake Casitas. So this basically is about, 70 miles of coastline. You can see that UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, is right in the middle of the Goleta Load Pocket there. And it incorporates the cities of Goleta, Santa Barbara, and Carpinteria as the largest load centers within the Goleta Load Pocket. The Goleta Load Pocket is extremely transmission vulnerable and disaster prone. So I think everybody has heard about the recent disasters within the last 18 months or so that have struck the Santa Barbara region, really hitting Montecito the hardest. And those were from fires and landslides or debris flows, as they're referred to locally. And this region, this whole Goleta Load Pocket, is served by a single transmission line, which in this map is shown by the purple trace line. So that is the only connection that the Goleta Load Pocket has to the transmission system, and that transmission connection runs right through the heart of the fire zone, landslide zone, and earthquake zone. So the Goleta Load Pocket is extremely vulnerable to transmission failure and also to public service power shutoffs, which the Southern California Edison has said that they will do. They will de-energize that transmission connection when there are red flag days, high fire risk days. Now, in order to provide indefinite renewables driven backup power to the entire Goleta Load Pocket, we need to get 200 megawatts of additional solar into the Goleta Load Pocket, along with 400 megawatt hours of energy storage. This will provide the Goleta Load Pocket with complete transmission resilience for what's called an N-2 outage. That's the term used in the utility industry when transmission connections go down. There's actually two transmission lines on that same transmission connection, and an N-1, meaning one of those lines goes down, is equal to an N-2. They will both go down if either one of them goes down. And by the way, 200 megawatts of solar is equivalent to about 5 times the amount of solar that is currently deployed in the Goleta Load Pocket, and it also represents about 25% of the energy mix. Hey, that's the goal for community microgrids, to get to about 25% of the energy mix. There are multi-gigawatts of solar siting opportunity that exist in the Goleta Load Pocket on commercial scale built environments like parking lots, parking structures, and rooftops. The majority, by the way, are on parking lots. About 80% of the commercial scale siting opportunity is on parking lots in the Goleta Load Pocket. And that's pretty standard for urban and suburban areas, by the way. 200 megawatts of solar represents about 7% of the total technical solar siting potential in the Goleta Load Pocket. So we're not talking about, this isn't a impossible task here. It's about 5 times more solar than already exists in the Goleta Load Pocket, and it represents about 7% of the technical siting potential of the built environments, rooftops, parking lots, parking structures, specifically in the Goleta Load Pocket. Other resources like energy efficiency, demand response, and offshore wind can significantly reduce the solar and storage requirements. But assuming it was we solved this problem 100% with solar and storage, we need 200 megawatts of solar, new solar, and 400 megawatt hours of energy storage. So importantly, the Goleta Load Pocket has a benefit, even though it has the 2 transmission lines run along the exact same towers. So an N-1 equals an N-2. If the transmission system goes down, it's down. There is no more transmission connection to the Goleta Load Pocket. If that happens, there are 3 distribution lines noted here in this diagram as tie lines. Those are distribution lines that come up from Ventura up through Carpinteria, and those will turn on. So we can have power coming in and serving a good portion of the load through those distribution lines that are normally not turned on. They're normally what's called open, which means there's no electricity flowing across them. This is just a view of the electrical system that serves the Goleta Load Pocket. Obviously there's a need for resilience in the Goleta Load Pocket. We've got the Edison fire back in 2016. So, one could ask here, what came first, the transmission lines or the fire? The transmission, lines themselves are inherently risky, as evidenced by the fact that the utilities are now going into major power system, public safety power shutoff mode, and planning to turn their transmission infrastructure off when there is high fire risk days. They don't want to be the cause of the fire. Then in December 2017, the Thomas fire, again, obviously, was putting our transmission system at significant risk, and there were multiple outages that occurred over those days. Okay, so need for resilience in the Goleta Load Pocket. The transmission lines are subject to preemptive shutoff, known as the public safety power shutoff. Again, this map shows how the transmission line comes right up through the middle of the high risk fire zone. That you could overlay a map with the landslide zone, because that transmission line runs right along the backside of the mountains, and the earthquake zone, right? All of that puts that transmission line at significant risk. All right, whoops, that was not supposed to be in there. The Clean Coalition, a little history in terms of how the Clean Coalition came to initiate the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid initiative. We started off by getting involved when Southern California Edison was trying to repower the Elwood gas peaker plant in Goleta, and that peaker plant. By the way, I grew up in Santa Barbara, so I've since moved myself from Menlo Park back to Santa Barbara a little over a year ago, and this is hometown for me. So when I found out that Southern California Edison wanted to repower the Elwood peaker plant in Goleta and have that operational for the coming decades, I joined the group, the World Business Academy, Community Environmental Council, Sierra Club, and a whole bunch of others, many others who were fighting against the the gas peaker plants. I say plants plural because not only was the Elwood gas peaker being proposed for repowering, which would mean it would run for many more decades, but there was a massive new gas peaker that was proposed for Oxnard called the Puente gas peaker plant. So the Clean Coalition got involved to basically do a significant technical and economic analysis. And we, in part, helped to make sure that those two peaker plants got blocked. And I'd say that this slide and the data here really shows the value that the Clean Coalition brought to the game, which was that we did a very significant technical analysis to make sure that that solar plus storage, or essentially put another way, a community microgrid approach was totally sufficient to meet the technical needs of what was being proposed for service by the gas peakers. So we proved that out first, and then we analyzed how much solar and storage would be needed, and we costed that out, we priced that out, and we showed that the solar plus storage approach was by far the most cost economic approach. And I say by far because you can see on here that this top group of bars, the Clean Coalition solar plus storage was 267 million. And this is just for reliability, by the way. Reliability and resilience are two entirely different things, and reliability is much easier to satisfy. So we didn't need to do the full 400 megawatt, 200 megawatts of solar and 400 megawatt hours energy storage. But we did need a combination of solar and storage to meet the reliability needs, and that came out to 267 million, which was about 30 million less than the Edison proposal to build the Puente gas peaker plant. And by the way, the Edison proposal only included the capital costs, right? The upfront costs. It did not include the tremendous costs of operating a natural gas peaker plant over time. So if you properly did the analysis over lifetime costs, the cost effectiveness of solar plus storage or the community microgrid approach is far better than these bars even show. So in general, it's important to point out that natural gas infrastructure is not resilient. A lot of parties, a lot of utilities, even policymakers tend to assert that gas-driven generation is resilient. The reality is that gas infrastructure is not resilient because it takes much longer to restore than electricity infrastructure. So the table at the right, or the chart at the right, shows for a earthquake in San Francisco, 7.9 earthquake, all of their services go dark, right? There's no electricity, no gas, no water, no anything. And in order to reestablish service, they can get to 60% of the electricity customers back in 3 days. And it would take them 30 times longer. It would take them 3 months to get back to 60% service restoration for natural gas. So, there's natural gas actually represents significant threats. The natural gas is obviously flat out dangerous. In a lot of highly flammable, running right through our neighborhoods and into our homes and businesses. And it's also highly vulnerable to earthquakes, fires, landslides, and terrorism. And you don't have to go all the way back to the San Bruno explosion, which that picture was up on the last slide. That was back in 2010. This slide was created about 6, 7, 8 months ago. And we just took a list of things that had happened within about the last year of making this slide. And already, just last week, there was another couple of explosions in the eastern U.S. It's really hard to just keep track of how much natural gas infrastructure is dangerous and not only not resilient, but causing communities to not be resilient, inherently not resilient. So after the Clean Coalition got involved in blocking the natural gas peaker plants in the Goleta Load Pocket and in Oxnard, we were put in touch with UCSB to do a preliminary community microgrid design for their emergency sheltering facilities. So UCSB is the primary sheltering site for all of the Goleta Load, was all of Santa Barbara County. And essentially Santa Barbara County is served by Southern California Edison in the southern part, and served by PG&E in the northern part. But all of Santa Barbara County, in a disaster, the emergency shelter of last resort is UCSB. And so we worked with UCSB to put a preliminary design together for making sure they had indefinite renewables driven backup power for their emergency sheltering facilities. That effort was intended to be proposed to the California Energy Commission for pursuing a grant to build it out. And along the way, the direction of the proposal got shifted to be more of one around demand response, which was not a winner. That was not what the CEC was looking for, and unfortunately, we weren't able to move forward with this UCSB community microgrid yet. I say yet because the design's there, and this can be picked up anytime that there are funds that are become available. And UCSB recently hired a person from UC Berkeley who is very focused on microgrids and community microgrids. And so we have leadership there now that is going to be very collaborative in looking to fulfill the vision of the Goleta Load Pocket community microgrid, and of course the significant role that UCSB can play in it. Shortly after the UCSB community microgrid project was rejected by the California Energy Commission, the fires hit in late 2017 in Montecito, and then a couple of months later, the debris flows hit. And this map is of the debris flows, and it basically shows the Montecito area and where you have extreme and high risk for debris flows in the event of major storms in the future. You can pretty much see that the entire Montecito community is covered, right, in either red or yellow, and is in extreme need of making sure that it has energy resilience overall, including energy resilience. So then the Clean Coalition, took this as an opportunity to make sure that we did a Montecito community microgrid as the first building block for the Goleta Load Pocket community microgrid. The first thing we did is we looked at where all the critical community facilities are in Montecito, and then we overlaid that with a solar siting survey of where we could put a whole bunch of solar energy. And what we came up with is the best place to do the Montecito community microgrid is in what's called the Upper Village area. And that's because it is the area that houses the Montecito Fire Protection District headquarters and its primary fire station. It also houses the Montecito Water District, which is the site of critical wells, water wells, and pumps. And when there's a fire, those pumps are working 24/7. They are pumping water up the hill, which is then gravity fed to fire hydrants and other water infrastructure that's needed to fight the fires and do everything you would normally do with water. So those pumps are absolutely critical. The fire and the water district are adjacent properties, which opens up some interesting opportunities if we can get Southern California Edison to cooperate the way we want them to, going in the future for really fulfilling the vision of the Montecito and Goleta Load Pocket community microgrids. But in addition to the Montecito Fire Protection District and Water District, down the street and down the feeder about a half a mile is kind of the central school that serves all of Montecito. It's called the Montecito Union School. Everybody in Montecito knows it. They either went there, have kids who went there, have been to events there. It serves the community in a really big way. And it is also the site of the Montecito Fire Protection District's emergency helicopter operations. They land and take off on the track field that is part of the school. The school happens to have another field that is perfect for emergency sheltering and staging, disaster recovery staging, and they have a big campus as well, which is useful for all of that as well. So this is a block diagram of the Montecito Community Microgrid. You've got the feeder runs along San Isidro Road. That's shown in teal here. It's ultimately served by the Santa Barbara Substation, which is a handful of miles away. And while it goes from the Upper Village, where we're doing our first deployment of the Montecito Community Microgrid, it runs through Coast Village Road, which is the primary commercial area of Montecito, and actually has it also has the most significant solar siting opportunities in all of Montecito. So as the Montecito Community Microgrid expands, we can pick up those sites that are in the Coast Village Road area and really make this a growing, dynamic community microgrid that just gets bigger and better as time goes on. I just want to point out that in this diagram, the pinkish plus signs, those are grid isolation switches. So right now, because we don't have cooperation from Southern California Edison to utilize the distribution grid when the broader grid goes down, we have to put all of our community microgrid assets behind the meters. So the fire district, water district, and Montecito Union School, they will have their own, they are anticipated to have their own microgrids. And if Edison is willing to play in the broader vision later, then we can add some additional assets, likely some of those assets being interconnected directly to the distribution grid. And then we use these grid isolation switches to make sure that the energy is getting to the most critical community facilities first, and then gets to other facilities, tier 2, priority facilities, and then tier 3, everybody else. As long as the tier 1, the critical facilities are served first and indefinitely with the renewables that are available, and then going to the tier 2 and tier 3. And I'll talk more about that later. So the Montecito Community Microgrid these are just some additional diagrams. I think that I have said just about everything that's on here except the bottom left section. So each site is anticipated to have an independent microgrid with enough solar and storage to be net zero. And when you size solar and storage to net zero a property in California with the solar resource quality we have in California, then you can deliver indefinite renewables driven backup power to the most critical loads. So that means you can cover 10% of the loads, 10% of the normal loads 100% of the time. And you can serve 100% of the loads at least 25% of the time. And I'll go through some more, I'll revisit those numbers a little bit later in the presentation. So, there's a lot of stakeholders involved in doing a community microgrid project, and anybody who's done a major infrastructure project knows, you've got your property owners and your municipalities, your policy makers, your utility, residents, your funders, your solution providers, right? All of these stakeholders come together and they have to be aligned in order to have a successful project. We have, and in large, with large support from the World Business Academy, we've been able to get alignment from these stakeholders, and the holdout is the utility, which is why we're stuck doing things behind the meters and not able to reutilize the existing distribution infrastructure, which would, truly fulfill the vision of community microgrids. I've personally met with Southern California Edison, over 24 times in the last 2 years while we've been working on efforts within the Goleta Load Pocket. And those meetings, span from the top of the organization, the CEO and president, down to the community representatives for Southern California Edison. And while all the meetings have been, very pleasant, they have not yielded the type of cooperation that we're looking for and that we need in order to fulfill the vision of community microgrids and to truly deliver this renewables-driven resilience to Montecito and to the broader Goleta Load Pocket. And kind of in line with that, getting information out of the utility has been very difficult. They provided some very basic information for a super peak day, which is kind of a hypothetical day that's going to happen sometime in the next 10 years of what the energy needs would be. We were able to cobble that together and reverse engineer some data that came out of Wildan, which had done the community choice aggregation studies for the original studies for Santa Barbara County and some of the cities in Santa Barbara County. And so by hook or by crook, we were able to, kind of reverse engineer what the needs are for getting the renewables-driven resilience for the Goleta Load Pocket. And we came up with, as I have said before, the 200 megawatts of solar and 400 megawatt hours of energy storage. And while that may sound like a tall task, I will say that the energy storage piece of it is already looking very promising. Southern California Edison, went through an RFP process and has applied for 280 megawatt hours. So we need 400 megawatt hours of energy storage. They've already applied for 280 megawatt hours of energy storage that would be online within the Goleta Load Pocket by March of 2021. So, we can get to the end game here for the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid as evidenced by, a really big step that Southern California Edison has made on the energy storage front. Also, if we bring other resources into play, for example, wind, offshore wind, off of Point Conception, which is in the Goleta Load Pocket, there is tremendous offshore wind potential. There's a developer by the name of Steve Weaver who has been working to uncover, what that potential is and how a wind project could be interconnected. And Steve's a former Southern California Edison guy. He understands the grid within the Goleta Load Pocket very well. He also, he was involved with a lot of the infrastructure that was put in place for the oil and gas industry that's operating off of Point Conception. And there are 3 oil platforms that are now obsolete. They're just sitting there. The only thing they do is turn lights on to make sure that boats don't crash into them. And the cost to get that infrastructure out is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And Steve has come up with a proposal that would allow at least, some of that infrastructure to stay in place to service a offshore wind project. This is a slide that Steve had provided that shows the little trapezoidal shape in the left-hand side of this chart is where the actual wind turbines would go. They would be, that energy would aggregate into facilities that would be sited on one of the oil platforms, one or more of the oil platforms. The thought is that there's siting potential without, getting in the way of any of the shipping operations. The shipping channel is marked off here in yellow. And to be able to basically interconnect that generation into the Gaviota substation, basically the existing infrastructure with some enhanced distribution upgrades between Gaviota and the Goleta substation could handle about 100 megawatts of offshore wind. That's not in terms of offshore wind projects, it's not a huge project, but it's big enough that you get a good amount of the cost efficiencies into the project. So, you know, so that's kind of the history of where we've been and how we got to the place where we're at with the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid. So now the question is, how do we realize the grander vision? How are we actually going to make this happen? So there's 3 steps. The first one is immediately and ongoing. We expand behind the meter solar and storage opportunities, and we do it behind the meter because the existing rules and market mechanisms are only viable for behind the meter interconnections and using net metering and the self-generation incentive program, et cetera. We got to keep doing as much of that as we can, right? The same, just exactly what we're doing in Montecito, and times it by 500. In the shorter term, or in the short, so that was immediate. Short term, we need to fix a misguided prohibition that the county of Santa Barbara has in several of its land use statutes to make sure that wholesale distributed generation can be utilized. And I'm going to talk about wholesale DG in a moment, but basically it's commercial scale renewables on built environments like rooftops, parking lots, parking structures. This prohibition, it's a prohibition against front of meter interconnections of solar. It's only a problem in the unincorporated areas. So, you know, the cities of Goleta, Santa Barbara, and Carpinteria don't have this problem, but it is a serious problem for making sure that we can truly unleash commercial scale renewables in the county jurisdictional areas. And then longer term, we need to unleash wholesale distributed generation and be able to utilize existing distribution grid infrastructure during transmission system outages. So there's a number of areas that we need to innovate. These are policy and market mechanism innovations. On the procurement side, we need to implement a comprehensive feed-in tariff. And I'm going to talk about all of these in a little bit of detail in a moment. So I'll just cover them quickly right now. In addition to procurement, we need to fix interconnection. We need to fix interconnection. So if you interconnect on the utility side of the meter, it's as straightforward as interconnecting on the customer side of the meter. There's no reasons exact same size project should be any different in the interconnection process for front of meter versus behind the meter. And then we need to get the valuation correct. We need to make sure that there is full and fair valuation for wholesale distributed generation. And this means eliminating the massive market distortion that exists with the way that transmission costs are metered and assessed in Southern California Edison service territory. We need to establish standardized value of resilience for tier 1, 2, and 3 loads. And I'll go through that again in a bit of detail in a moment. And then we need to implement a market mechanism for dispatchable energy capacity services that will attract wide deployment of energy storage that is owned by any party and is fully functional at the operational discretion of the load serving entities who can economically optimize the use of that energy storage, energy capacity, however they want and however that might change over time. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail momentarily as well. So let me first just talk really quickly about wholesale distributed generation. There's 3 big market segments when it comes to energy generation. There's behind the meter, which is generically retail distributed generation. You're serving on-site load and you're behind a customer meter. On the other side of the spectrum, there's central generation, which means you're interconnected to the transmission grid out in the middle of nowhere usually, and you have to travel over long transmission lines to get to the distribution grid, which is where people live and work and you actually have loads to serve. Right in the middle is this really untapped market segment, untapped in the United States, and I'll show you an example of where it is really utilized effectively. But untapped in the United States is wholesale distributed generation, which serves local loads, and is interconnected to the distribution grid. And just to give everybody a rule of thumb, if you look outside and you see wood power poles, you're on the distribution grid. If you look outside and you see steel transmission towers, you're on the transmission grid, and you're close to transmission infrastructure, which is you're usually not going to be around because nobody wants to live or work around transmission towers and transmission lines. So wholesale DG is this incredible market segment. The perfect case study is comparing Germany and its experience with solar versus California from the 2002 timeframe for the following 10 years. So this is a comparison of how much solar capacity was deployed in Germany in green versus California in red. And back in 2002, California had about twice as much solar deployed as Germany did. And then Germany unleashed its wholesale distributed generation market segment, while California focused on behind the meter and central generation. And the Germans ran laps around California in terms of deploying solar capacity. In fact, they deployed 10 times more solar than California did during that decade, despite California having a solar resource that's 70% better than Germany's. And the majority of German solar is small wholesale distributed generation. It's commercial scale, front of meter solar that is deployed on built environments, rooftops, parking lots, parking structures. So about 90% of all the solar deployed in Germany is on built environments, and the vast majority of that is on commercial scale. And if California had the efficiency of the German solar market, we would be doing rooftop solar today at 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on the size of the project. So wholesale DG is an amazing market segment to unleash. It will fulfill the vision of the Goleta Load Pocket and a whole lot more. And the way to unleash wholesale DG is through feed-in tariffs, because feed-in tariffs are unparalleled in unleashing cost-effective commercial scale renewables. And in fact, that is what the Germans used, is they used feed-in tariffs to unleash their wholesale DG, which obviously ran laps around whatever California's done. And California's ran laps around every other state. So, it's kind of a nesting example. So feed-in tariffs are basically a very straightforward market mechanism. The Clean Coalition has designed many of them. Our most recent feed-in tariff was designed for the city of San Diego. I think we're getting close to being able to release that, and we actually have released it in a filing to the California Public Utilities Commission. So for folks who are interested in seeing that, we can make sure to follow up and provide our filing to the California Public Utilities Commission, and from that you can get access to the feed-in tariff design. Feed-in tariffs work far better than net energy metering or auctions to unleash commercial scale renewables. NEM is great for residential, and it's great for about 25% of the commercial scale market segment, but as soon as you have sites that are non-owner occupied or split metered, like an apartment complex, condo complex, or you have a siting opportunity that is far bigger than the load, like a parking structure that has an elevator and some lights, but has massive solar siting opportunity, right? NEM doesn't work anymore. So NEM doesn't work for about 75% of the commercial scale opportunity out there. And auctions are great for super large projects, but they are phenomenally unworkable for small commercial scale renewables projects. So feed-in tariffs, the ones that the Clean Coalition designs, use market responsive pricing, which means that the pricing is always going to, new contracts for feed-in tariff projects will follow where the market response is. So if there's a lot of people who want to participate at a certain price, the price for subsequent projects will, for subsequent contracts will ratchet down. If there's not enough participation in the market, then the prices will ratchet up to some reasonable universal maximum that you just won't have any market activity if the prices are trying to go above that through the market responsive pricing mechanism. The Clean Coalition also has designed a dispatchability adder, which is a capacity bonus for energy storage, energy capacity that sits on top of the feed-in tariff rate, and it is designed to make energy storage get paired up with the renewable energy resources and to make the renewable energy fully dispatchable. So here's just a really clear example of a lot of what I just said in terms of why feed-in tariffs are needed. Direct relief is a disaster relief and recovery nonprofit that supplies. I think they're the largest supplier of emergency medical supplies to, and especially pharmaceutical medicines to anywhere in the world that there's a disaster. They just got done building a massive new facility, and they deployed a microgrid to net zero their property and to provide indefinite renewables driven backup power to their own facilities. And a lot of pharmaceuticals are temperature dependent, and so you basically have to have refrigeration as a big part of that operation out there at Direct Relief. I say out there because they're out near the Santa Barbara airport. And you can see from this picture that there's solar on the roof, but not nearly covering the roof. That's because that's the amount of solar that was required to net zero the property. And after that, you're just giving your energy away, so nobody does anything bigger than net zeroing. And there's also an energy storage facility out there as well. So there's enough solar and storage on their existing site to basically provide for indefinite renewables driven backup power to their critical facilities, and they stay operational, right, for their site only. Direct Relief would like to participate in a much bigger way in the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid and utilize all this extra space, rooftop and parking lot, but there's no market mechanism for them to do that. And so, we need to have a feed-in tariff, and we need to have a dispatchability adder to allow Direct Relief and sites just like it to maximize their siting opportunities and to make sure that we can site as much solar and energy storage on those sites as we possibly can. So there's a lot of numbers here. This presentation is going to be available to everybody. So I'm going to, I want to make sure we got some time for questions. So I'm going to keep moving through this. And this is a really important point. Auctions and solicitations have massive failure rates and are expensive to participate in, which means they're not appropriate for commercial scale projects. Just participating in a auction, a utility sponsored, RFP, RFO, auction process, whatever you want to call it, would require at least $100,000 in costs to get site control, which is always a requirement, and to put your bid in. And then you do all that, you spend your $100,000, and you're going to have a 90+% chance of losing. In California, RPS solicitations have 97% failure rates, right? 97% of the projects that are bid in do not get contracted. And these bar charts kind of show where all the breakdown is. But the bottom line is that it is insane to think that auctions could possibly attract commercial scale renewables and other DER, and yet California utilities and policymakers chronically prove Einstein's definition of insanity by continuing to pursue local renewables and other DER via auctions. Okay, out of the last big RFP that Southern California Edison did in the Goleta Load Pocket, they came up with 0 renewables that were that passed any muster, and that's mostly because almost nobody bid in renewables, because you're the only siting opportunities for solar in the Goleta Load Pocket are commercial scale. You're not going to be able to pave over a mountain and put a bunch of solar panels there, right? We're talking about rooftops, parking lots, parking structures. Average project cost is going to be about $500,000 to deploy. You can't spend $100,000 to put a bid together with a 90+% chance of losing. That is a recipe for bankruptcy. So on the interconnection side, wholesale DG and NEM interconnection need to be aligned. If you interconnect in front of the meter with wholesale DG, right, you're going to have a cost experience that is 10 times more than the cost of doing a NEM interconnection. You're going to have a time frame that is 2.5 times as long as a NEM interconnection. That is not, not a way to open up a market. This slide is a comparison of the time it takes to deploy a wholesale DG project in Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD, versus an investor-owned utility. So SMUD can do these projects in 6 months on the interconnection, and that same interconnection process would take 3.5 years on average, or an average of 2 years for the interconnection. So 4 times longer in a California investor-owned utility like Southern California Edison than it would for a municipal utility like SMUD. Okay, that's just wrong. So the Clean Coalition has designed a interconnection pilot to basically streamline wholesale DG interconnection. We can make sure that there's a link to that pilot when we circulate the follow-up to this webinar. I think I want to make sure we got a little time for questions, so I'm going to move on. In terms of valuation, we've got to fix the transmission access charges. I'll let people look through this slide later, but basically in participating transmission owning utility service territories, the utilities are charging for transmission costs, transmission usage fees at the customer meter, which means they have no ability to tell whether the energy actually used the transmission grid or not. How can you charge a usage fee for the transmission grid when you're not sure if it actually used the transmission system? And those costs are significant. They are equivalent to an average of about 3 cents a kilowatt hour in California. So that's massive market distortion that is stealing from wholesale distributed generation. And by the way, it also steals from NEM export. So net metering energy that is exported is also suffers when that energy gets sucked into a neighboring meter, customer meter. Value of resilience. Clean Coalition has an initiative to standardize the value of resilience. And we do that by looking at tiering the loads. So you take a facility and you tier it into tier 1, mission critical and life sustaining loads. Tier 2 are priority loads that you will maintain as long as you can do so without threatening the ability to maintain your tier 1 loads. And then tier 3 loads, which is everything else. And basically in California, typically your tier 1 loads are about 10% of the total. Tier 2s are about 15%, and the discretionary tier 3 loads are about 75% of the total. If you size solar and storage for net zero in California, you will be able to keep indefinite renewables from backup power to about 10% of your total load. So you can get those tier 1 criticals supplied with indefinite renewables from backup power. If you do that, you can keep those tier 1s going 100% of the time. You can also keep your priority loads going about 80% of the time. And you can keep 100% of your loads, including your tier 3s, going about 75% of the time. And that's what's shown in this chart. The dispatchable energy capacity services, this is a new market mechanism that the Clean Coalition is just getting ready to push at the California Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission and other places. And it basically is it's dispatchability adder that we had in our feed-in tariff, but it's more generalized so that a load serving entity can contract for energy storage, energy capacity out of a battery, and use that energy capacity for whatever they want. They can use it for load shifting, ramp smoothing, frequency balancing, voltage balancing, whatever they want. And they can change what they want to use it for over time, day a week, season of the year. Maybe the deck curve gets flattened out over time and they don't need it for load shifting anymore. They can use it for whatever they want over time, over the contract period. What the storage asset owner gets is a single bankable revenue stream And that is missing in the market today. You keep hearing about storage providers. Oh, they want to, stack up demand response and some frequency regulation services and blah 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 blah. And they still come out with only paying for 25% of the installed cost of the battery capacity that they're using for those services. Right? There's the market mechanisms today do not work. So why do we keep on trying those? Let's invent something new. So dispatchable energy capacity services is that something new that will work. The dispatchable energy capacity services needs to start with a cost of service approach for getting the initial price, and then use a market responsive pricing mechanism for adjustments over time. The cost of service needs to incorporate the net cost of the energy that's coming in and out of the battery, the capital expenditure, and the operating expenditure of the battery capacity that is being utilized for the DECS services. So just my last couple slides here. This is taking a look back at the block diagram for the Montecito Community Microgrid. And I had talked about, we've got those grid isolation switches on the feeder. This is something that, Southern California Edison will do eventually, because they're going to have to do it, whether they want to or not. And that's partly because it's already happening in other places. So the Clean Coalition has a major project in San Francisco called the Valencia Gardens Energy Storage Project. This is a real photo. There's a whole bunch of solar at the site already. This is a low-income senior living apartment complex called Valencia Gardens in the Mission District of San Francisco. It's stacked up with solar on the rooftop, as you can see. And all that solar is interconnected on the utility side of the meter. It's front of meter interconnection. We are attaching an energy storage battery in front of meter as well. It's the first merchant energy storage system in California, certainly on the distribution system, and probably in the United States. It's merchant. There are no contracts for this front of meter interconnected energy storage. But we are going to soak up a whole bunch of that solar, and we set the stage for providing indefinite renewables driven backup power to about 20% of this senior and low income housing complex, if we can get PG&E to put the proper grid isolation switches in place, which we will work to do. They obviously will need to have a way to get compensated for their part of the solution, and they should, right? So there's a lot of policy innovation, market mechanism innovation that's required to make sure that the utilities come out of this hole as well. But I do want to show that PG&E is getting creative on this front. They've come out with what they call resilient zones. This is a generic picture of a resilient zone. We are working with PG&E and working to provide a resilient zone for the city of Calistoga, which had two public service power shutoffs happen to them very recently, one of which lasted for 48 hours. You can imagine the city of Calistoga was not happy about that. And so there's going to be a resilience zone design there. The Clean Coalition is doing much of that design in partnership with PG&E. And PG&E is going to put in grid isolation switches. Those are those orange dots in this picture. They're also going to put in a pre-installed interconnection hub, which means that is a site that you can roll in a big battery. You could roll in some type of generator, or you could eventually put a big solar project or some other renewable energy resource right there. Right, it's set to basically plug in whatever you want. On a temporary basis or a permanent basis. And so this future where you're utilizing the existing distribution grid is already happening, and PG&E in California is leading the way for that. So this is my last slide, and how can you get involved in the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid? First of all, you can contribute to the funding requirements. This doesn't happen for free, and so far the Clean Coalition has been begging, borrowing, and stealing to keep this initiative going. Ideally, I would staff it with several full-time equivalent experts to fulfill the vision, and those experts would include a policy person as well as a full-time engineer. You can also bring properties into play. The solar getting 200 megawatts of solar into the Goleta Load Pocket is going to be the hardest challenge. And so we need properties to raise their hand and say, I want solar at my site, and to make sure that we can do that, we can help to take a look at that and see if it's something that we can do in the near term under a NEM arrangement, or whether we just put it on the list and stage it for when wholesale distributed generation projects are possible, because of policy and market mechanism innovations that the Clean Coalition will help to bring into place. You can also bring solutions to the Goleta Load Pocket. We've got lots of parties who want to bring solar and energy storage here already. There's room for a lot more. We've got lots that needs to get done here. But we also need folks who are thinking deeply and have solutions around demand response and electric vehicle charging infrastructure and energy efficiency. And then, of course, you can share the Goleta Load Pocket Community Microgrid with others as a game-changing showcase for delivering renewables-driven resilience to communities. And the last and most, I guess, easiest thing you could do is just subscribe to the Clean Coalition newsletter to stay informed as we make progress. And with that, I will, I'll take as many questions as we can fit in here.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, we got a lot of great questions today, so I'm going to just go through some of them. So you mentioned this earlier in the webinar, but maybe you could expand on it. Chris Grecian, who's a consultant at the World Bank in Washington State, is just simply asking, what's the difference between resilience and reliability?
Yeah, great question. So reliability is based on capacity. So if you put a whole bunch of battery systems in place and you got 100 batteries are measured in power capacity, which is measured in let's call it megawatts, and then energy capacity, which is megawatt hours. Reliability is dependent on the power capacity, megawatts. Doesn't matter if there's any energy in the battery or not. You will check the box as long as you would check the reliability box as long as you have the power capacity in place. Resilience is a whole different story. Resilience is based on the energy capacity. If the transmission system goes down, the Goleta Load Pocket needs to have energy in order to keep the lights on. The power capacity doesn't do anything for you if the batteries are empty and it's midnight and there's no solar. So you've got to be, resilience requires deep thinking about energy capacity, and reliability is you check the reliability box with power capacity.
Great, thank you. This question comes from Claire Broom. She's an adjunct professor at Emory University in California. Claire asks, what are the cost implications of having to work behind the meter versus in front of the meter?
Great question, Claire, and thank you. And Claire's a big champion for a lot of everything we're doing too. The cost implications are that you're having to do things in a suboptimal fashion. So if you think about that direct relief example, you basically cited about 25% of the amount of solar you could have put on that site, and you get economies of scale when you do things in a bigger way. So you would be able to maximize the site, get as much economies of scale in play as you possibly can, and that would significantly bring down your, that would improve your cost effectiveness. The other thing that's important is that when you interconnect energy storage behind the meter, if it's part of a net metering, if that site is net metered, you are not allowed to export any energy out of that battery to the grid, which is a huge limitation and a silly one, especially for the situations where the energy storage is getting 100% of its energy charge from renewables, which almost all of the projects do, because that's the only way you get the tax benefits extending to the battery. You have to have, to get 100% of the tax benefits extended to the battery system, you have to have 100% of your energy sourced that goes into that battery from renewables. Otherwise, you lose the tax benefits. So there's some really silly limitations that exist when you're behind the meter. particularly around the energy storage, and that kills the economics as well, right? You're having to do a whole bunch of suboptimal things to work around silly policy and market mechanism limitations.
Great, thank you, Craig. This question comes from Mark Roast. He's the Director of Marketing and International Development at Sustainable Energy Incorporated in California. It's a three-part question, so if you need me to repeat anything, just let me know. Mark asks, how much storage would be needed to optimize the microgrids you are discussing today? And how much as distributed storage, building by building, and how much for individual microgrid elements? Also, in light of what you said about utility non-cooperation, how much additional storage could mitigate the impacts?
So I'm not quite sure, exactly. Mark, hello. I've known Mark a long time. So I think he might be talking about the Montecito project. So I'm going to let you do the math, Mark. But between the three sites, the fire, water, and school, we've got about 500 kilowatts of solar. So these are small projects, and cumulative, right, across the three sites. And we've got about 1 megawatt hour of energy storage, right? And that ratio is pretty constant. This might be the answer to one of your questions. The ratio between the solar, 500 kilowatts of solar, you multiply that by 2 hours, right? And that gets you your energy storage. The rough rule of thumb between how much solar you're going to need and how much energy storage you're going to need is going to be, you take the solar capacity and you multiply by 2 hours. And so 500 kilowatts and 1 megawatt hour of energy storage. 500 kilowatts of solar, 1 megawatt hour of energy storage. So that's what we need across those three sites. That ratio I just gave you is essentially pretty standard to get the kind of resilience benefits that I'm talking about. I'm not quite sure if there were other things in there, but you can contact me separately, Mark, if you need more clarification. Let's move on to the next question.
Great, thanks, Craig. This comes from Bill Buchin, and I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced that correctly. Bill, he's the CEO at Market Potential Incorporated, also in California. Bill asks, who will manage the GLP microgrid, and are they capable of managing a high number of DER sources? Also, other than more RE generation, what else is needed to get more RE locally and become more resilient and sustainable?
Yeah, so I love this question because it tees up something that I had meant to touch on in my presentation, and that is the concept of a distribution system operator. The Clean Coalition believes that the utilities should be forced to divest their transmission investments because that would solve a whole bunch of problems overnight, including turning them into very fierce competitors as distribution system operators, meaning that the only way that they could make money in the future is by enhancing the distribution grids and essentially deploying community microgrids everywhere. And so I believe that the right player for or at least the first right of refusal for becoming the distribution system operator should go to the existing utility. I know other people may have different opinions about that, but I think that that's the right thing to do. They've got the expertise. They're already running the distribution grids. They know how to do community microgrids. They just haven't wanted to do it because it takes away too much of their primary cash cow business, which is central generation, and their real primary cash cow is transmission investments. They make a far higher rate of return on equity on transmission investments than they do on distribution grid investments, and the depreciation schedules are twice as long. They're 50 years instead of 25 years. So they get to clip coupons for forever, right, with transmission investments, and put huge amounts of operations and maintenance into those as well. So I think that the kind of the key answer here is we need to form distribution system operators. I think the existing distribution utilities are the right players to do that, and I think they're fully capable of doing it. And they just need to have the will to do it, or they have to have the edict to do it, one or the other. In terms of the Goleta Load Pocket, there's an interesting opportunity. This was what I was going to touch on. UCSB is served by a 66 kV feeder which is a distribution feeder that comes out of the Goleta Substation. And then they basically, their customer meter takes that 66 kV and turns it into a 12 kV circuit that, or substation that serves the UCSB campus. And it is the perfect place to simulate a DSO, because you can do it all within the distribution grid. You don't have to have CAISO's participation. California Independent Systems Operator operates the transmission grid. Ultimately would be the trading partner for the trading between the transmission system and DSOs, once we form DSOs. But the Goleta Load Pocket is a perfect proving ground for how a DSO would operate, and doing it at UCSB is the perfect place. And UCSB, as I mentioned before, they've brought on a faculty member who's focused on microgrids and community microgrids, and they've got the talent there now to run a research simulation like that, and to be a big player in kind of this grid of the future. And then the Goleta Substation is about 3 miles away, right? So once you prove it out in a simulated fashion down at the distribution level, you can roll it up the hill 3 miles away to the transmission distribution substation and bring CAISO into an actual DSO pilot project that would be truly trading between the transmission system and the distribution system at the Goleta Substation. It's the perfect site for the Goleta Load Pocket, is the perfect place to really move forward with the whole DSO concept.
Thanks, Craig. We still have quite a few people still online, so if it's okay, we can keep going for a few more minutes.
Yeah, sure thing.
This question comes from Larissa Dobriansky. Larissa asks, what kind of business models are being pursued for the microgrids? What is the reason why there's a lack of cooperation from utilities? And do they seek to own and operate their own microgrids?
Yeah, great question, Larissa. And we've known each other a long time. A lot of these questions coming from people who I've known for a long time. Some of the veterans in the microgrid world. So right now the resistance, I think, is coming from the utilities not knowing how they're going to get compensated. There are real costs to utility to do a community microgrid, right? And I'll be the first one to admit it, and we need to make sure that they are compensated for whatever they do. They need to make capital expenditures to put the things like grid isolation equipment in place. They need to get they need to put in distribution energy management systems and advanced distribution management systems, right? There's systems, software and hardware that needs to happen. And then, to the prior question, there are operational requirements, right? If you have a community microgrid and you're saying you're going to have indefinite renewables driven backup power to the fire station, you damn well better have indefinite renewables driven backup power to the fire station. Right, so whoever is on the hook for that, presumably that would be the utility, right? It's their distribution grid, and they're going to need to be compensated. They're not going to come and just do all that for free, right? That's not the way capitalism works, and that's not the way it will roll out. They're going to have to get compensated for that, and they'll have to be compensated fairly. And I'm all for it, right? Right now those market mechanisms are not in place for the utilities. So they're very reluctant to move into this direction. And in addition, right, as I hinted before, they make a lot more money on their transmission investments, and the energy generation is a bit of a zero-sum game. The more you get locally, the less you need from remote. Now, before I put, if there's any utility people on this call, before anybody panics, the Clean Coalition believes that the end game is 25% of the energy will come from local renewables, and the vast majority, the 75%, will come from remote. So we're still going to have a whole bunch of remote renewables in the game, and that those remote renewables are still going to need the transmission system. So none of that's going away. But what will change is that we'll have a lot more of new generation being added to the distribution grid, and as that happens, we're going to need less investment in new transmission infrastructure, and that's a threat to utilities. It's a real threat, and they have a conflict of interest, and it's an obvious one. Anybody who knows anything about economics, you're gonna choose the 12% FERC guaranteed ROE, and that, you know, that lasts for 50 years, or are you going to choose the 8% ROE that lasts for 25 years, right? That's the difference between investing in transmission investments and distribution investments. You would have to be stupid to not choose the 12% ROE for 50 years, right? So how do we get rid of that? Well, we force the utilities to divest their transmission investments. The transmission system is already operated by CAISO. There's no operational difference. And it's just it's purely an investment, you know, shift, and utility investors will be made whole because they'll just transfer transmission assets into cash, right? And they can use that cash to build out their distribution grids. But that is an inherent conflict of interest, and one that needs to be addressed.
Great, thank you, Craig. All right, how about one more question? This one comes from Lucas Schroyer. Lucas works at Navigant Consulting in California. Lucas asks, I know the Clean Coalition is focused on clean power, but if the goal is resiliency, what's the cost effectiveness and use cases for diesel backup generators versus solar plus storage? Is anyone pushing for diesel gen?
Yeah, really good question, Lucas. And you know, the answer is that while, you know, indefinite renewables driven backup power is getting, you know, people very excited, because diesel doesn't get you indefinite renewable. It doesn't get you indefinite backup power, right? Obviously, it's not renewable, but it doesn't get you indefinite. The average diesel generator, you know, installation has 2 days of diesel fuel on site. So, you know, after 2 days, then your lights out. So if your disaster, you know, has the grid down for more than 2 days, you know, it's great. You're going to be, you know, you're going to have your lights on for 2 days, and then your lights out. The benefit of the renewables driven resilience is that it's indefinite for your critical loads, and it's you know, almost indefinite for your priority loads as well. And so these are not comparable solutions. You get diesel gets you essentially 100% of your load backed up for for a small percentage of the time, right? 2 days, whereas the renewables get you a small percentage of your load backed up indefinitely, and all your load, you know, for about 25% of the time. So, you know, using that example I gave for solar plus storage in California. But you know, to you know, just be totally, you know, transparent, and you know, the fire station and the water district, they already have diesel generators. Those will remain in place, and they will be the backup to the backup. The Clean Coalition doesn't try to tell people don't put don't take your diesel generator out. Like, have it there as the backup to the backup, and then as you get comfortable over the years that you didn't have to use it, and then when it hits end of life, don't replace it. But Montecito Union School doesn't have a diesel generator, and they probably never will. And I would assert they will never need one, because they will have indefinite renewables driven backup power for all of their needs, and they'll have everyday value that comes from the solar and the storage. The storage provides demand charge management and time of use arbitrage benefits, and then it provides obviously the kind of the critical link to bridging your solar through a 24-hour period, and not just when the sun is shining, for resilience needs. So I think that you know, lots of places, lots of critical facilities already have diesel generators. Those diesel generators would probably stay in place in most of these cases. But when they hit end of life, then a decision will be made as to whether they are replaced, which would be completely unnecessary if they were not needed, you know, over the performance period that folks got comfortable. Yes, the renewables and the storage made it happen and did everything we need.
Great, thanks, Craig. We do have one other question that I could ask. It's on feed-in tariffs, and I know that that could be pretty helpful. This comes from Alex Papalexopoulos, President and CEO of ECHO International in California. So he asks, you advocate feed-in tariffs for compensation. Of course, this provides a fixed payment, removes price risk, and reduces market risk, but it is unresponsive to market prices and distorts wholesale markets. The world is moving to feed-in premiums where the price is indexed to the wholesale market price. In the long term, this is better. And Alex is asking if you can comment on any or all of that.
Yeah, so the Clean Coalition feed-in tariff designs actually are totally responsive with market dynamics. So they basically get you the best of both a streamlined procurement process and the market responsiveness of an auction without all the parasitic costs associated and risks associated with an auction. I'm not familiar with the indexing to the wholesale markets, but I do know that wholesale markets move around a lot. And what you need as a renewable energy, and or microgrid developer is you need certainty. You know what your costs are today. You know how much it's going to cost you for your CapEx. You know how much it's going to cost you for your OpEx. And what you need is certainty around the price that you're going to get, the revenue stream you're going to get, such that you can make the economics work. Right? If you're subjected to the vagaries of a wholesale market, which change by the day and maybe by the hour or 5-minute interval even, right? There's no certainty to that, and so there's tremendous amount of risk. You're going to have a lot less participation, particularly from small players who just can't afford to take that kind of risk. So the Clean Coalition believes that the right way to go after the commercial scale market segment, of wholesale, it's the small side of the wholesale distributed generation. This is on rooftops, parking lots, parking structures. You need to make sure that you have a feed-in tariff that has a market responsive pricing mechanism attached to it. And this is exactly how we designed our feed-in tariff for the city of San Diego. So you're welcome to look through that. And Alex, we've known each other a long time too. So you're the long lost cousin of one of the Clean Coalition team members, as we recently discovered. But the same type of market responsiveness, ties to the dispatchability adder or the dispatchable energy capacity services more generally as well, right? You come up with a cost of service determination for your starting price, and you contract at that price, but then every subsequent tranche of additional program capacity that gets released to the market is going to be priced at a level that is dependent on how the market responded to the prior price, right? But once you're set on a price, you're contracted for your 20-year period, and you're set, right? And you were able to make sure that the economics work for you, and you could bring your solution to the market, and you didn't have to have a 90+% failure rate of participating in an auction and take all that risk and uncertainty. So I think hopefully that answered your question, but if you still have lingering questions about it, you should look through the feed-in tariff design that we'll make sure you can find through the CPUC filing we made when we distribute our follow-up email to this webinar.
Great, thank you, Craig. And that's all the questions we're going to get to today. Great presentation, excellent Q&A session. And thank you everybody for sticking around a little bit longer than planned. We got a lot of good content in there at the end. So look out for a series of emails about our next webinar, which will be happening in mid-August. And check our website for presentations from past webinars. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks very much again.
Thanks, everybody.